The grizzly bear stood 9 feet tall when it rose on its hind legs, its claws extending 4 inches from massive paws that could decapitate a man with a single swipe. Lowen Crale had perhaps 3 seconds before those claws would find him. His Hawken rifle lay 15 feet away in the dirt, where the charging bear had knocked it from his hands. His knife was still sheathed at his belt. Every mountain man who survived the Rockies knew the iron rule: never let a grizzly get within 20 yards. Crale had broken that rule, and now he was about to pay for it with his life. Or so the bear thought. What happened in the next 10 seconds would change how mountain men approached the most dangerous animal in North America. Crale didn't run. He didn't reach for his knife. Instead, he did something so counterintuitive, so seemingly insane, that witnesses would spend the next 30 years arguing about whether they had actually seen it. The technique he employed that day in the autumn of 1837 was based on knowledge that took him 5 years to acquire, 3 grizzly encounters to test, and 1 moment of absolute clarity to perfect. Within 2 years, mountain men across the Rockies were using variations of his method. Within 5 years, the grizzly fatality rate among trappers had dropped by more than half. Yet the technique was never written down in any manual, never taught in any formal way, and remains largely forgotten by modern hunters who face these same animals with far superior weapons. To understand why Crale's discovery was so revolutionary, you need to understand what made grizzly bears the apex predator of the American frontier. The grizzly bear that inhabited the Rocky Mountains in the 1830s was not the same animal that exists in protected parks today. These were animals that had never learned to fear humans. They weighed between 600 and 900 pounds, with some specimens exceeding 1,000 pounds. Their skulls were so thick that rifle balls often failed to penetrate. Their muscle density was such that shots to the chest rarely reached vital organs. Their temperament was legendary among the tribes who had hunted them for centuries: aggressive, territorial, and nearly impossible to stop once they committed to an attack. The Blackfeet called them real bear, and considered killing one to be the highest martial achievement. A warrior who killed a grizzly with a bow and arrow could wear a necklace of its claws and command respect from every tribe between the Missouri River and the Pacific coast. The Crow had stories of grizzlies that survived dozens of arrows and continued fighting. The Shoshone told of bears that had been shot through the lungs and still killed the hunters who wounded them. These were not exaggerations designed to impress white traders. They were survival information passed down through generations. When American trappers first entered the Rockies in significant numbers during the 1820s, they brought weapons that had proven effective against black bears in the eastern forests. The standard trapping rifle of the era fired a ball weighing about half an ounce, propelled by 80 to 100 grains of black powder. This was sufficient to kill deer, elk, and even black bears with proper shot placement. Against grizzlies, these weapons were marginal at best and suicidal at worst. The problem was threefold: penetration, stopping power, and reliability. Penetration was the first challenge. A grizzly's hide in autumn, when bears were fattened for hibernation, could be nearly an inch thick in places. Beneath that hide lay a layer of fat that could exceed 4 inches on a well-fed animal. Beneath the fat was muscle so dense that experienced hunters compared it to oak wood. A rifle ball had to pass through all these layers and still retain enough energy to damage vital organs. Shot placement became critical, but the targets were small and constantly moving. The heart was protected by the massive shoulder structure. The lungs were large, but could sustain considerable damage before the bear lost function. The brain was protected by a skull that could deflect poorly aimed shots. Stopping power was even more problematic. Unlike deer or elk, which would typically flee when wounded, a wounded grizzly would almost invariably attack. The bear's nervous system and circulatory system were designed for survival. Even with a mortal wound, a grizzly could remain active for several minutes, more than enough time to kill multiple hunters. Mountain men learned quickly that shooting a grizzly often meant you had simply made it angry and given it a target. The concept of a stopping shot that would instantly drop a grizzly was largely mythical with the weapons available in the 1830s. Reliability was the third factor. Black powder rifles required dry powder, proper loading, and careful maintenance. In the mountains, where hunters forded rivers, endured rain and snow, and went weeks without proper cleaning supplies, rifles frequently misfired. A misfire when hunting elk meant you lost your dinner. A misfire when facing a charging grizzly meant you lost your life. Every mountain man carried the knowledge that his weapon might fail at the critical moment. The standard wisdom among trappers in the early 1830s was simple: avoid grizzlies whenever possible. If you encountered one, back away slowly and hope it wasn't interested. If it charged, shoot for the head and pray your ball penetrated the skull. Then reload as fast as humanly possible, which took a skilled man about 25 seconds under ideal conditions and considerably longer when your hands were shaking from fear. Most grizzly encounters ended in one of three ways. The bear lost interest and left. The hunter managed a lucky shot that stopped the bear, or the hunter died. There was no reliable technique for deliberately hunting grizzlies, which is why most mountain men didn't even try. Lowen Crale arrived in the Rocky Mountains in the spring of 1832 as part of a fur brigade working out of Fort Union. He was 23 years old, 6 feet tall, and lean in the way men became when they lived on meat, and walked 20 miles a day through mountain terrain. He had grown up in Kentucky hunting deer and black bear, and he believed his shooting skills would translate to the western mountains. He was wrong, and he learned just how wrong during his first autumn in grizzly country. Crale had set his trap line along a creek that fed into the Yellowstone River. The beaver were plentiful, and he was pulling good pelts from his traps every morning. On the 4th day, he found one of his traps sprung and empty. The beaver that had been caught in it was gone, and massive tracks in the mud told him what had happened. A grizzly had discovered his trap line and claimed it as a feeding station. This was a common problem for trappers. Grizzlies quickly learned that traps meant easy meals, and once a bear started raiding traps, it would continue until the trapper either moved his line or dealt with the bear. Crale decided to deal with the bear. He positioned himself in a tree overlooking the trap and waited. Just before dawn, the grizzly appeared. It was a large male, probably 700 pounds, moving through the brush with surprising silence for such a massive animal. Crale waited until the bear was examining the trap, quartering away at about 40 yards. He aimed for the shoulder, hoping to break bone and reach the lungs. He squeezed the trigger, and his Hawken roared. The bear spun at the shot, roaring in pain and fury. Crale could see blood on its shoulder, a good hit, but the bear didn't go down. Instead, it charged directly toward his tree. Crale frantically began reloading, his hands shaking as he measured powder and seated a ball. The grizzly reached the base of his tree and stood upright, swiping at the lower branches. Crale pressed himself against the trunk, his rifle only half loaded, watching those claws slash through wood like it was paper. The standoff lasted 15 minutes. The bear wouldn't leave, and Crale couldn't finish reloading without exposing himself to those claws. Finally, the bear dropped to all fours and wandered off into the brush, still bleeding from the shoulder wound. Crale finished loading his rifle and stayed in that tree for another 2 hours before he climbed down. He never saw that particular bear again, but he never forgot the lesson. Shooting a grizzly was easy. Stopping a grizzly was something entirely different. Over the next 2 years, Crale heard every grizzly story the mountain men had to tell. He listened to Jim Bridger describe a fight where a grizzly took 11 rifle balls before it died. He heard about Hugh Glass, who survived a grizzly attack in 1823 that left him so mutilated his companions dug him a grave and left him for dead. Glass crawled 200 miles back to Fort Kiowa, motivated by pure rage and the desire for revenge against the men who abandoned him. The story became legendary not because Glass survived, but because his survival was so improbable. Most men attacked by grizzlies didn't survive. Crale paid particular attention to the Native American hunters he encountered. The Flathead had been hunting grizzlies for generations, and they had developed techniques that white trappers generally dismissed as primitive. Crale didn't dismiss them. He watched and learned. He noticed that Flathead hunters never hunted grizzlies alone. They used teams of 4 to 6 hunters who coordinated their shots. They targeted specific times of year when grizzly behavior was more predictable. They used terrain to their advantage, positioning themselves in places where wounded bears couldn't easily reach them. Most importantly, they studied bear behavior with an intensity that white hunters rarely matched. The flathead told Crale something that contradicted everything he thought he knew about grizzlies. They explained that bears were not mindlessly aggressive. They were territorial and defensive, but they followed patterns. A grizzly that was feeding was more dangerous than a grizzly that was traveling. A sow with cubs was exponentially more dangerous than a lone male. A bear that had been wounded by humans before would react differently than a bear that had never encountered humans. This information was practical rather than romantic. The flathead weren't interested in proving their bravery by fighting grizzlies unnecessarily. They were interested in obtaining claws and hides while surviving the encounter. Crale began experimenting with positioning and timing. In the spring of 1834, he encountered a grizzly digging for roots in a meadow. Instead of shooting immediately, he watched. He noted how the bear moved, how it paused to test the wind, how it became completely focused on digging once it located food. He circled downwind and approached to within 60 yards. The bear never detected him. He aimed carefully and shot the bear through both lungs from a broadside angle. The bear ran 30 yards and collapsed. Crale had made a good shot, but he had also chosen his moment carefully. The bear had been distracted, positioned perfectly for a killing shot, and hadn't known a hunter was present until the ball struck. This became Crale's first principle: control the encounter before it begins. Don't stumble into grizzlies and react with panic. Choose when and where you engage them. Use terrain, wind, and behavior to create advantages before you ever pull the trigger. It sounds obvious, but in practice it was revolutionary. Most trappers encountered grizzlies by accident and had to deal with whatever situation developed. Crale was learning to create situations where he held every advantage. The second principle came from failure. In the autumn of 1835, Crale tracked a large grizzly into heavy brush. He knew the bear was wounded from an earlier encounter with other trappers. He knew it was dangerous. He went into the brush anyway because he wanted the hide. The bear was waiting. It came out of the undergrowth like an explosion, covering 20 yards before Crale could raise his rifle. He shot from the hip, missed completely, and ran. The bear caught him after 40 feet, swatting him sideways into a fallen log. Crale somehow got his knife out and stabbed at the bear's face as it tried to bite him. The knife struck the bear's nose, and the bear recoiled long enough for Crale to scramble over the log and into a space too narrow for the bear to follow. He lay in that space for 3 hours while the bear waited outside. Blood soaked his shirt from claw wounds across his back and shoulder. His ribs screamed with pain. He couldn't tell if anything was broken, but he could barely move. The bear eventually lost interest and left. Crale waited another hour before crawling out. It took him 2 days to walk back to his camp, and he spent a month recovering from wounds that should have killed him. The experience taught him the second principle: never enter terrain where a grizzly has the advantage. No hide, no matter how valuable, was worth dying for. Fight grizzlies in open ground where you can see them coming and have room to maneuver. Avoid thick brush, deadfall timber, and narrow canyons. If a bear wants to make a stand in bad terrain, let it win. Territory means everything to bears and nothing to humans. You can always find another place to trap. The third principle emerged from observation rather than personal experience. In the summer of 1836, Crale was camped with a group of Shoshone hunters. They invited him to join a grizzly hunt they had planned. 6 hunters were going after a large male that had been raiding their horse herd. Crale expected them to set an ambush and shoot the bear from cover. Instead, they did something completely different. The Shoshone hunters located the bear in a section of open valley. They approached from different directions, staying visible, making noise. The bear stood up, trying to identify the threat. The hunters began shooting arrows, not all at once in a volley, but in sequence. One arrow, then another, then another. Each arrow struck the bear from a different angle. The bear charged toward the nearest hunter, who retreated while the others shot. The bear turned to charge a different hunter. The pattern repeated. The bear was never allowed to close with any single hunter because the others would shoot it from behind. After 8 minutes and more than 20 arrows, the bear collapsed. Crale was impressed by the coordination, but initially thought the technique wouldn't work with rifles. Arrows could be shot quickly, but rifles took time to reload. Then he realized the principle wasn't about rate of fire. It was about controlling the bear's attention and never letting it commit fully to attacking one target. If you could keep a grizzly confused about which threat to address, you could prevent it from using its primary weapon, focused aggression. This principle required multiple hunters and careful coordination, but Crale began to think about how it might be adapted. What if a single hunter could create the same confusion? What if you could make a grizzly hesitate even for a few seconds without needing multiple shooters? The answer came to him during the winter of 1836 to 1837, and it came from watching dogs. Fort Union kept several large dogs for hunting and camp protection. One afternoon, Crale watched two dogs corner a wolf that had been raiding the fort's meat cache. The wolf was larger than either dog individually, but the dogs worked as a team. When the wolf focused on one dog, the other would dart in and bite. When the wolf turned to address that threat, the first dog would attack. The wolf couldn't commit to fighting either dog because turning its back on the other was too dangerous. Eventually, the wolf broke and ran, and the dogs ran it down. Crale began thinking about presence and positioning. What if you could position yourself in a way that made a grizzly instinctively uncomfortable even before it attacked? What if you could use the bear's own defensive instincts against it? Bears were territorial and aggressive, but they were also cautious. A bear that wasn't sure about a threat would often bluff charge, testing whether the threat would flee. A bear that was confident about a threat would commit to a full attack. The difference between the two scenarios often came down to how the bear perceived the threat. Crale started testing his theory in the spring of 1837. When he encountered grizzlies, he didn't immediately retreat or adopt a defensive posture. He held his ground but positioned himself at angles that bears seemed to find uncomfortable. He noticed that bears approaching head-on were more likely to commit to an attack. Bears approaching from an angle where they had to turn their heads to track, you were more hesitant. He began positioning himself so that bears had to approach him from their weaker side, forcing them to adjust their angle of attack. He also experimented with movement. Static targets seemed to trigger attack responses more reliably than moving targets. But certain types of movement triggered attacks while others didn't. Moving away from a bear signaled prey behavior and often triggered pursuit. Moving perpendicular to a bear seemed neutral. Moving toward a bear at an angle rather than directly at it created confusion. The bear couldn't categorize the threat clearly. Was this prey running away? Was this a predator approaching? Was this something to fight or something to avoid? The technique Crale eventually developed combined positioning, movement, and timing in a way that no other mountain man had attempted. He called it setting the angle, and it worked like this. When encountering a grizzly at close range, instead of backing away or standing still, you moved laterally while keeping your rifle ready. You positioned yourself so the bear had to turn to track you, but you never turned your back. You maintained eye contact but didn't stare directly, which bears interpreted as a challenge. You moved with confidence but not aggression. You created a situation where the bear had to constantly adjust its position to face a threat that was moving in ways it found difficult to predict. The critical moment came in establishing what Crale called the window. This was a specific distance range, typically between 15 and 30 yards, where a grizzly that was considering an attack would make its decision. Too close and the bear would attack out of defensive instinct. Too far and the bear might simply leave. Within the window, the bear was evaluating. This was where setting the angle made the difference. A bear that had to work to track a moving target was less likely to commit to an attack because it wasn't sure the attack would succeed. Crale's technique didn't make grizzly hunting safe. Nothing could do that. What it did was reduce the number of situations where a grizzly committed to a full attack from certain to probable. It gave a hunter options beyond shooting and praying or running and dying. It used the bear's own behavior patterns to create hesitation and uncertainty. The real test came in October 1837, and it happened exactly as described at the beginning of this account. Crale was checking his trapline when he walked into a grizzly feeding on a deer carcass. The bear was so focused on eating that it didn't detect Crale until he was within 20 yards. At that range, the bear's defensive instinct took over immediately. It charged without hesitation. Crale's rifle was knocked from his hands in the first seconds. The bear was between him and his only firearm. He had a knife, but using it meant getting within claw range, which was suicide. He had perhaps 3 seconds before the bear closed the distance and killed him. Instead of running or reaching for his knife, Crale did something counterintuitive. He moved laterally, fast, forcing the bear to turn. The bear adjusted, but Crale kept moving, not in a circle, but in an arc that kept him at the edge of the bear's effective range. The bear stood up to get a better view, and Crale shifted his movement pattern. The bear dropped to all fours and charged again, but Crale had created enough distance that he could angle away from the charge while continuing his lateral movement. For nearly 30 seconds, Crale maintained this pattern. He never stopped moving. He never turned his back completely. He never let the bear set itself for a committed attack. He used every piece of terrain available, a fallen log that the bear had to navigate around, a small depression that broke the bear's line of sight for a moment, a cluster of saplings that forced the bear to choose a path. Each obstacle was minor, but collectively they disrupted the bear's ability to execute a straightforward attack. The bear was powerful and fast, but it was also confused. The threat kept moving in ways that didn't match prey behavior. The threat wasn't running away in a straight line, which would have triggered full pursuit mode. The threat wasn't standing still, which would have made it an easy target. The threat was doing something the bear couldn't quite categorize, and that uncertainty created hesitation. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute, Crale managed to circle back to where his rifle had fallen. He grabbed it, and the bear, seeing the object that represented danger, finally broke off the encounter. It didn't flee, but it backed away, still watching, still ready to attack if Crale made the wrong move. Crale held his position, rifle ready, letting the bear decide to leave on its own terms. After another minute, the bear turned and walked away into the timber. 2 other trappers had witnessed the encounter from a distance. They had watched Crale's rifle get knocked away. They had seen the bear close to within feet of killing him. They had seen something they couldn't fully explain, where a man, without a loaded weapon, had survived a close encounter with a grizzly through movement and positioning alone. Word of the encounter spread through the mountain man community with the speed of gossip in a small town. By the time the story reached the winter rendezvous of 1838, it had been embellished and distorted, but the core facts remained. Crale had survived a grizzly encounter at point-blank range without firing a shot. Other trappers wanted to know how. Crale was reluctant to discuss it initially. He knew his technique worked for him, but he wasn't sure it would work for others. Teaching someone to set the angle required them to overcome every survival instinct that told them to run or stand still. It required confidence and practice. It required staying calm when a 700-pound predator was trying to kill you. These weren't skills you could teach around a campfire. But the requests kept coming, and Crale eventually began demonstrating the technique to small groups of trappers. He used logs and markers to show positioning. He had men practice lateral movement while keeping a target in sight. He taught them to read terrain for obstacles that could disrupt a bear's attack path. He emphasized that setting the angle wasn't about fighting a bear, it was about creating conditions where the bear chose not to fight. Not every trapper could master the technique. Some men simply froze when facing a grizzly, their bodies refusing to move in the controlled, purposeful way the technique required. Others moved too aggressively, triggering attacks instead of preventing them. But for the trappers who could internalize the principles, the results were dramatic. Men who had previously avoided grizzly encounters began hunting bears deliberately. The fatal attack rate dropped noticeably throughout the late 1830s. The technique spread through demonstration and word of mouth rather than written documentation. Mountain men were not, as a rule, literary people. They shared information through stories and personal instruction. Crale's method became part of the practical knowledge that separated experienced trappers from novices. Old hands would tell newcomers, if a grizzly gets close, don't run, set the angle. Then they would demonstrate what that meant. The impact extended beyond individual survival. With better techniques for dealing with grizzly encounters, trappers could work in areas they had previously avoided. Trap lines could be set in prime beaver habitat without the constant fear that checking traps would mean fighting bears. The economic effect was significant. Trappers who could operate more safely could take more pelts, which meant higher profits for the fur companies and better pay for the men doing the dangerous work. Crale himself continued refining his technique through the late 1830s and into the 1840s. He developed variations for different situations: how to set the angle when encountering a sow with cubs, when facing multiple bears, when working in terrain with limited room to maneuver. He learned that the technique worked best against male bears, which were more territorial and less protective. Sows with cubs were more unpredictable and less likely to be deterred by movement that didn't take them away from their cubs. In those situations, Crale advised avoidance rather than engagement. He also learned the limitations of his technique. It didn't work if the bear was already wounded and in full attack mode. It didn't work if you stumbled into a bear at extremely close range where there was no window to establish positioning. It didn't work if terrain prevented lateral movement. Understanding these limitations was as important as understanding the technique itself. Part of Crale's teaching emphasized knowing when to use the method and when to rely on other survival strategies. By 1842, Crale had been in the mountains for a decade. The fur trade was declining as beaver populations dropped and fashion trends shifted away from beaver felt hats. Many mountain men were transitioning to other work, guiding wagon trains, scouting for the army, trading with tribes, or returning to settlements in the east. Crale stayed in the mountains. He had married a Flathead woman and had integrated into her tribe's community. He continued trapping on a smaller scale and teaching younger men the skills they needed to survive. His reputation as a bear hunter was such that tribes would sometimes request his help with problem grizzlies. A bear that was raiding food caches or threatening people would become his responsibility. He approached these hunts with the same methodical preparation he brought to everything. He studied the bear's patterns, identified likely locations, set up positions with clear fields of fire and good escape routes. He never took unnecessary risks. His goal was to kill problem bears efficiently, not to prove his courage. In one documented case from 1844, a large male grizzly had killed 2 Flathead hunters and was terrorizing a section of the Bitterroot Valley. The tribe asked Crale to deal with it. He spent a week tracking the bear, learning its movements and habits. He identified a meadow where the bear came to feed in the early mornings. He constructed a simple blind from logs and brush that gave him concealment and protection. He positioned himself so that the bear would approach from his left, giving him a clear shot at the vitals when the bear turned broadside. The hunt succeeded on the 3rd morning. The bear arrived just after dawn and began feeding on camas roots. Crale waited until the bear was positioned perfectly, then fired. The ball struck the bear behind the shoulder, passing through both lungs. The bear ran 60 yards and collapsed. Crale waited another 10 minutes before approaching to confirm the kill. The bear was massive, probably 850 pounds, with claws that measured 4.5 inches. The hide was presented to the tribe, and the claws were divided among the families of the men who had been killed. Crale accepted no payment beyond gratitude and a supply of dried meat. The technique he had developed continued to spread throughout the 1840s and 1850s. Mountain men who had learned from Crale taught others. Variations emerged as different hunters adapted the basic principles to their own situations and capabilities. Some men developed elaborate movement patterns. Others focused on using terrain more effectively. Some emphasized the psychological aspect of creating uncertainty in the bear's mind. All of them benefited from the core insight. You could influence a grizzly's behavior through positioning and movement in ways that made survival more likely. The end of Lowen Crale's life came not from a grizzly bear, but from the winter of 1856. He was 47 years old and had spent more than 2 decades in the mountains. That winter was particularly harsh, with temperatures staying below zero for weeks. Crale and his family were camped in a traditional winter location, but food was scarce. He went out hunting in conditions that were dangerous, looking for elk or deer to feed his family. He didn't return. Search parties found his body 3 days later. He had apparently broken through thin ice crossing a river and succumbed to the cold. His rifle was still in his hand, powder horn dry in its case, knife in its sheath. He died doing what he had always done, taking calculated risks to provide for the people who depended on him. His flathead wife and 3 children mourned him according to tribal custom. The mountain men who knew him shared stories of his skill and courage at that spring's rendezvous. His legacy lived on in the men he had taught and the technique he had perfected. By the 1860s, as the frontier pushed westward and more hunters entered grizzly country, the survival skills that Crale had developed became standard knowledge. Hunting guides taught clients to set the angle when encountering bears at close range. Army officers instructed their men in proper behavior around grizzlies. Settlers moving into Montana and Wyoming learned the basics of bear awareness and defensive positioning. The grizzly bear population declined dramatically in the late 1800s as hunting pressure increased and habitat was lost to settlement. The bears that remained became more wary of humans, having learned through bitter experience that humans were dangerous. The dynamics that Crale had studied and exploited, where bears were confident and aggressive because they had rarely encountered effective human resistance, changed as bears adapted to a new reality. Modern bear encounters are fundamentally different from those of the 1830s. Today's grizzlies in the lower 48 states are protected and managed. They live in specific regions and generally avoid humans. When encounters occur, they're usually the result of surprise or food attraction rather than territorial aggression. Wildlife managers teach avoidance and de-escalation. Carrying bear spray is standard practice. The idea of deliberately hunting grizzlies is considered either sport hunting under strict regulation or unnecessary risk. Yet Crale's core insight remains valid. Understanding animal behavior and using that understanding to manage encounters is more effective than relying solely on weapons or physical force. Modern bear safety training emphasizes many of the same principles Crale discovered through experience. Don't run from a bear, because that triggers pursuit. Don't stare directly at a bear, because that's confrontational. Create distance through lateral movement rather than retreat. Use terrain and obstacles to disrupt the bear's ability to close quickly. These aren't new ideas. They're rediscoveries of knowledge that men like Lowen Crale developed when their lives depended on it. The story of how one mountain man's technique made hunting grizzlies twice as effective isn't really about hunting. It's about observation, adaptation, and the application of knowledge under extreme pressure. Crale didn't invent a new weapon or discover a secret weakness in grizzly anatomy. He studied behavior, identified patterns, and developed a method for managing encounters that gave him options beyond violence or flight. His success came from treating grizzlies not as monsters or targets, but as animals with predictable behavioral responses that could be influenced. He learned to read terrain and use it strategically. He developed the mental discipline to stay calm and analytical when instinct screamed at him to panic. He taught others not just what to do, but how to think about the problem of coexisting with the most dangerous predator on the continent. The mountain men of the 1830s and 1840s operated in an environment where mistakes were usually fatal. There were no rescue helicopters, no emergency medical care, no safety nets of any kind. Survival required skill, knowledge, and the ability to make good decisions under conditions of extreme stress. Men like Lowen Crale survived and thrived because they were constantly learning, constantly adapting, constantly refining their understanding of the wilderness and its dangers. His contribution to the collective knowledge of mountain men was significant. The technique he developed saved lives, increased safety, and expanded the operational range of trappers working in grizzly country. It spread through the informal network of mountain men precisely because it worked. Men didn't adopt setting the angle because it sounded impressive or because Crale was persuasive. They adopted it because when they used it, they survived encounters that would otherwise have killed them. The broader lesson extends beyond bear encounters or frontier survival. Innovation doesn't always require technology or resources. Sometimes it requires observation, analysis, and the willingness to question conventional wisdom. The standard approach to grizzly encounters in the 1830s was fight or flight. Crale developed a third option: manage the situation to prevent fighting or fleeing from becoming necessary. That cognitive shift from reactive to proactive threat management was his real contribution. Teaching people to set the angle required more than demonstrating movements. It required teaching them to read situations, anticipate behavior, and stay calm under pressure. These were not natural talents. They were learned skills that required practice and mental discipline. Crale understood that the physical technique was useless without the mental framework to support it. His teaching emphasized decision-making as much as positioning. The fact that his technique wasn't formally documented meant that it evolved organically as different trappers adapted it to their own strengths and situations. There was no orthodoxy about the correct way to set the angle. The principle remained consistent, but the application varied. This flexibility allowed the technique to spread more widely than it might have if Crale had insisted on rigid adherence to a specific method. Modern hunters facing grizzlies have advantages Crale never had. Powerful rifles, bear spray, radio communication, detailed maps, weather forecasts, and the backing of professional wildlife managers. Yet they still face the same fundamental challenge: how to coexist with a large, powerful predator that can kill humans when circumstances align badly. The answers that Crale developed through hard experience remain relevant because they're based on understanding bear behavior rather than overpowering bear strength. The historical record of mountain men and grizzly encounters is fragmentary. Most trappers didn't keep detailed journals. The stories that survived were often embellished or simplified. But the pattern is clear. Trappers in the late 1830s and 1840s had better survival rates in bear encounters than those in the 1820s and early 1830s. Improved weapons played a role, but technique and knowledge played a larger role. Men learned what worked through collective experience, and they passed that knowledge forward. Lowen Crale's name isn't in history books. He never published accounts of his hunts. He didn't seek fame or recognition. He was a working trapper who developed a better way to manage a serious occupational hazard, then taught that method to others who needed it. His legacy is in the uncounted number of trappers who survived encounters with grizzlies because they had learned to set the angle, creating space and uncertainty that made bears choose not to attack. The technique died out as the frontier closed and the dynamics of human-grizzly interaction changed. By the early 1900s, grizzlies were rare in most of their historic range. The few that remained were wary of humans. The need for techniques to manage close encounters diminished. The knowledge that Crale and others had developed became obsolete, preserved only in scattered journals and the fading memories of old men who had trapped in the mountains decades earlier. Rediscovering that knowledge requires reading between the lines of historical accounts, interviewing descendants of mountain men, and analyzing Native American hunting practices that white trappers adapted. It requires understanding that frontier survival wasn't about individual heroics, but about accumulated knowledge passed from experienced to inexperienced. The mountain men who thrived were those who learned fastest and adapted best to conditions that could kill the unprepared without warning or mercy. Lowen Crale survived in the mountains for 24 years. He raised a family, built a reputation, and died doing work he had chosen. The technique he developed doubled the effectiveness of grizzly hunters, not by making them twice as deadly, but by making them twice as likely to survive the encounter and hunt again. That's the real measure of success in an environment where learning usually happened through survival or death, with no middle ground for error.